Good morning and good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us on today's webinar. My name is Michael Lewis. I run ESG research at DWS, and I'm very pleased to be presenting this and hosting this water risk webinar today. I'd also like to thank the PRI for enabling this webinar. In a way, we are warming the waters ahead of the PRI's digital conference on October the 18th to the 21st. Our discussion today has three parts related to water, whether it's too much, too little, or too polluted. And we want to examine why water is financially material for investors. We want to showcase new investor opportunities for corporate engagement relating to water. And finally, to provide recommendations as to how to drive change and solutions. As this is a live webcast, please post your questions on the right-hand side of your panel. We'll do our best to answer them, probably at the end of our conversation. But I'm honored to be joined today by four very distinguished guests, really leaders in their field. And if I may, I'll start in Sacramento, California, and introduce California State Controller Betty Yee. Controller Yee, I would love to share all of your biography to the audience because it is so fascinating. But if I may just share a few highlights. As California State's Chief Fiscal Officer, you serve on the boards of the US's two largest pension funds, CalPERS and CalSTRs, with a combined portfolio in excess of $760 billion. As California State Controller, you also helped launch the Climate Action 100 Plus and the Investor Agenda to accelerate action for the Paris Climate Agreement objectives. You also serve on the boards of California's coastal communities, as well as the Ocean Protection Council. So it's an honor for you to be here. So thank you so much for joining us. If I move a little bit further south to Los Angeles, I want to introduce Kirsten James, who's the Water Program Director at Ceres. And Ceres really has been at the forefront of the sustainability agenda for more than 30 years, and actually was amongst the first nonprofits to actually highlight the risks posed by water from a financial perspective. So Kirsten's work involves leading the Valuing Water Finance Initiative, and we're going to dig deep into that area of her work during this conversation. Moving over to London, a little bit closer to where I am, is Kate Lamb, the Global Director of Water Security at CDP. Kate is also the water lead at this year's COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow, as well as being the co-chair of the Science Based Targets Network Council. And finally, my colleague, Francesco Curto, who heads research at DWS. Francesco actually is a little bit further south, down in southern Italy, not only experiencing wildfires, he and his community earlier this year is now actually dealing with, I think, major thunderstorms, 15 centimeters of rain, I heard you were saying earlier, Francesco. Francesco and his team published actually late last year a paper on transforming the water framework with policy recommendations. So we will explore a little bit about that as well. But thank you all for joining us. I want to start running as we go into this webinar. So if I may, Controller Yee, could I come to you first and really ask you why, in your role as California State Controller, you are concerned about water risk?
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, good afternoon. It's really an honor to be a part of this panel and to really underscore the importance of water risks to our financial systems and certainly for institutional investors. As you mentioned, I do serve as a fiduciary on both of our largest public pension funds. I'm also a Ceres board member and a founding member of the Valuing Water Finance Task Force. You know, as the fiduciary of the two largest public pension funds in the nation, I believe it's crucial, really crucial, that investors and others understand the risks facing investments related to water. But here in California, we have just some unique, interesting events happening around water. The water crisis is here. It's now. And the numbers really speak for themselves when we look at California. 2/3 of our water here goes to agriculture, and as I think about how the fifth largest economy in the world actually has about $21.7 billion annually in total agricultural exports, we know that the ramifications for water in California really are global. And here in California also, in our laws, we actually have a declaration that water is a human right. And when we think about the risks to water, I personally think about the ultimate stranded asset related to water being people. And in California, it's estimated that 1 million people are going without safe drinking water. And the crisis has been exacerbated, obviously, by the growing threats caused by climate change. And so I believe there's just an acceleration now that we're seeing with respect to the water crisis as it relates to climate change. And many people, mostly those who are already the least shielded from the impacts, are left to bear the brunt of it. And so we're in a crisis, but we also know that there are opportunities as well. And I'm just really happy to be part of the panel that can look at both sides of the equation.
Thank you so much. I wanted to introduce Francesco now to the conversation, because in a way, Francesco, we spent so much time on climate, and investors spend a lot of time on risk management. And the two together, are these actually flawed? Can we do a lot better in addressing water specifically? And has it been a little bit overshadowed with what's been going on the climate side?
Yes, the answer is simply yes. There is a fundamentally problem with the way that investment community has been addressing the water risk or climate risk or human rights risk, whatever risk, because primarily historically this has really been a risk management approach, where what you're trying to do is to see the risks that such events may have to the financial return of your portfolio. But really, it's a flawed approach, because by ignoring the impact that capital actually has on the environment, what we are doing is accumulating problems. So whatever financial return we may be getting today or tomorrow in the next 2 months, the fundamental story is that this financial return is not sustainable in the long term, right? So what we must do is to move from a single materiality perspective, from a risk management perspective in addressing water risk, to embed double materiality, because only in this way we can ensure that we fulfill really our fiduciary duties and ensure that the return is sustainable in the long term. So we really need to embed in our investment frameworks the impact that that activities have on the world, on water risk, on whatever risk. So this is, the first important risk that you need to take care of. The other important elements that we must sort of take into consideration in the flawed approach that we have with regard to climate change is that, the focus of climate change, whenever I listen to people, is all about reducing emissions, okay? Is about emissions coming down, and is all about climate. But what we are forgetting is that the strong interconnection that exists between climate and other capitals, and the other capitals being freshwater, being oceans, being forestry, being biodiversity. Interesting to see about California and your role on oceans and forestry. We hear all about these things being intertwined. And this is particularly important because what we forget in addressing climate change is the essential role that two natural capitals will play in the future with regard to climate change. And it is the role that oceans and forestry have on them being a natural tank of CO2 emissions. So we really must move from a single materiality perspective to a climate change that also incorporates water risk, that incorporates oceans, that incorporates forestry. We cannot keep on working the same way as been working in the past.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting here is the information. We need much more information. So Kate, CDP, has been running the only global corporate water disclosure and accountability platform, I think for more than a decade now. The data you collect, gives us a front row seat on water risks and opportunities, that companies are facing. What do you find? What are you extracting from this data?
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, everybody. Good afternoon. It's great to be here. As you said, it's been a decade that we've been running this disclosure program, and I've been there for about a decade as well. So it's almost as old as my service to CDP is. And it's quite excitingly, we had over 3,300 companies disclose water-related data to investors and buyers via CDP this year. And the data that they provide to us is really varied in terms of its coverage and its breadth. We have information based on the types of risks and opportunities that these companies are facing, as well as the strategies that they're deploying in order to mitigate those risks, both from a whole enterprise perspective, but also at a very granular facility level, to help us understand what steps they're taking to mitigate risks and impacts. And what they're telling us is that when it comes to water security, companies cannot afford to wait to take action. The vast majority of the publicly listed companies that are disclosing to CDP last year, in fact, 75% of them disclosed that water security poses a substantive threat to their ability to do business, both in the short and medium term. Of the vast majority of risks that companies were disclosing to us, 95% of them are anticipated to impact either now or in the next 3 years. So this is really not something that we can afford to kick into the long grass. This is very much a problem to be dealt with and tackled instantly. These risks vary in terms of their makeup, whether they're physical risks, that the tap might stop, for example, and water resources may run out and be depleted. But interestingly, there are also a range of regulatory risk, whether that is increasing enforcement of regulation that already exists, or indeed in some cases a lack of enforcement of regulation that is posing a risk to these companies. Other risks, of course, as you might expect, include reputational risk, where a company, whether it is perceived or it is really impacting freshwater resources, say, for example, from a pollution perspective, is exposed to really substantive reputational risks that could affect their ability to secure the license to operate that they need, or indeed to secure the customers that they want to buy their products and services. Overall, the business value at risk the companies disclosed to CDP last year topped out at over $300 billion. This is, again, not something that they can afford to sweep under the carpet and forget to deal with in the longer term. But excitingly and rather encouragingly, what our analysis found is that the cost to mitigate these risks is 5 times less than the cost of inaction. And so I'll come back to that statement a moment ago, that what the data is telling us is that companies cannot afford to wait, and they shouldn't really afford to wait to deal with this issue. And encouragingly, from a performance perspective, we are seeing that there is a trend in freshwater withdrawals beginning at least to appear like they are beginning to stabilize or reduce amongst a large proportion of the disclosing companies. And as you might imagine, with that decrease in water consumption and water withdrawals comes a decrease in dependence, and therefore a decrease both in terms of environmental impact and risk exposure. If you are no longer dependent on what will inevitably be a scarce resource, then your source of risk does decrease. Unfortunately, however, this same type of performance is not being seen from a pollution perspective. And our analysis last year found that just 4% of the 3,000 companies that we analysed were setting or making any progress against pollution-related targets. This is the next frontier for business action. If we do not address water pollution and increase the quality of the water that is available for people and places, then ultimately we're undermining human rights, we're not meeting our legislative requirements, and we're undermining our own ability to achieve a resilient, stable future. So the data itself is rich, the stories are compelling, and the case for action that it is giving us is really clear.
Yeah, and I guess one of those action points, Kirsten, is really the Valuing Water Finance Initiative. So how does Ceres see this Valuing Water Finance Initiative as getting more investors to the table on addressing water risks? How are we mobilizing that?
Yeah, well, thanks, Michael, and good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all. So just taking a step back, for over a decade, Ceres has been working with investors to really unpack the issue of water risk and look at integration and investment decision-making through tools such as our Investor Water Toolkit, for example, and also working to really engage with companies within their portfolios that really need to take action and mitigate this water risk. And many of my fellow panelists have been great partners in these efforts. And, we've seen some great traction on this work. We really need to note that. Our Investor Water Hub, which is a peer working group, working on these issues is now at over 140 members and representing over 36 trillion in assets under management. And that's a great, terrific group and shows some great traction. But as Controller Yee so well described, the water crisis really is playing out at a dizzying pace in real time around us. Whenever you pick up the papers, you really see it playing out. And so the bottom line is that we need a much larger tent of investors, and we need bolder action to ensure that at the end of the day, we're going to have the sustainable water resources that we need. Just as a side note, Ceres is set to release the 4th iteration of our benchmarking report called Feeding Ourselves Thirsty. And in this report, we benchmark the leading food and beverage companies on their water management. And we are still seeing some noteworthy progress, but the bottom line is that we still have a really long way to go to ensure that we're having sustainable water resources. As Francesco noted, climate change is maybe more broadly recognized as a financial risk, but we really need to think holistically, and there still needs to be work done to really elevate water risk among institutional investors. So to get to your question, Michael, to really broaden the tent, so to speak, in partnership with the Valuing Water Initiative of the government of the Netherlands and many investor leaders, we launched the Valuing Water Finance Initiative and Task Force. And really, we're looking to bring sort of a new innovative approach to really move capital markets to view water as this great financial risk that it truly is, and then act on it accordingly. So what is it exactly that we are doing? So first off, we've partnered with key asset owners. We're calling this group the Valuing Water Finance Task Force, and also a big group of asset managers. And these investors are really helping us to elevate the issue of water risk, speak with their peers, and also importantly, build a really solid case for action to mitigate this risk. So there's 3 main pillars of the work to really build this case and create that solid foundation. So for the first piece is really building out that scientific case. There's a lot of science out there, a lot of academic research about the water crisis and, in many cases, industry's role in the water crisis. However, it really hasn't been synthesized or articulated by leading scientists in a way that really can support investors in building that case. So that's what we're trying to do with the support of a scientific advisory committee and the Global Institute of Water Security. We're really helping to build that case, that scientific backing for investors. The second pillar is the business case. Really, in order for institutional investors to take water seriously, we may need to make that risk all the more tangible. And so I'll talk about that in a little bit, but we really are using this initiative to build out that business case. And then finally, we're in the process of co-developing with our investor task force and other partners what we're calling the Valuing Water Corporate Expectations. What we've found is that a significant challenge that many investors are facing is there really isn't a clear North Star or framework for water, similar to the Paris Agreement, for example. And so as an investor, it could be hard to engage with your portfolio companies on water without really knowing what to ask for that's really going to get to that impact on the ground that we need. And so the corporate valuing water expectations are being co-created with investor input, and really this will help guide those conversations with companies to really, again, get us that on the ground change that we need. So just in summary, and working in lockstep with our investor partners and stakeholders through the Valuing Water Finance Initiative, we're really building out that case to hopefully compel investors to act on water risk and join us in the investor engagement that we plan to be launching next year.
Well, that brings me back actually to you, Controller Yee, if I may. I mean, you are engaged with Ceres on the Valuing Water Initiative. Could you how do you see the efforts of this group as being important?
Absolutely, Michael, for everything that Kristen just stated, but also to Francesco's point. This is really centering and focusing on water as a significant risk. And I think it's critical that the financial sector take water risk more seriously and really account for its true value. This is something that I think we all have known kind of around the edge that we're going to have to grapple with, but really until now, we haven't really centered focused on it, but we have more tools to help us do that. Water is a unique resource. I agree with Francesco. It is one of the two forms of capital that we really need to pay attention to because it so undergirds all of the drivers of economic growth. When you look at food production, when you look at energy generation, when you look at all kinds of industrial activities, human health, and also, I would say, political stability. And so when you look at all of that and how it affects certainly the performance of institutional investors, it's critical that we center focus on water. This initiative is going to help build, I think, all of the necessary resources and tools and leadership necessary to change the way that the private sector sees water and hopefully drive companies to systemically change the way that they value and use water across their business. And I love the fact that we have more to work with now. And so as institutional investors, we really do rely on so many of the tools that Ceres and others have developed.
That's great. And actually, Kirsten, I think, can you share some more details of how you're working with partners, you're looking to kind of improve and bolster the understanding of the material risk? I think we've got a slideshow actually, so we're going to shake it up a bit here to the audience. We're going to show you a few slides, Kirsten, which I think you've prepared, and which I think we're going to do that. But if you can share your sort of, what are the material risks associated with water management? What have your findings been showing you in this work?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So we wanted to give the audience sort of a sneak peek of some of the ongoing research of the Valuing Water Finance Initiative. So as mentioned earlier, I spoke of those 3 pillars, and one of the key pillars is really bolstering the financial case around water risk. And we think that that's really critical to compel more investors to come to the tent. So we've undertaken an effort to develop a set of materiality briefs. On the slides, you see the sort of 3 pillars articulated. And so we're calling, the financial piece of this, the materiality briefs. And with insights from our investor colleagues, we really want to ensure they are, resonating. So we're getting a lot of great insights from Controller Yi and her colleagues and others. So specifically, the briefs will highlight, first, the potential value that can be preserved through paying closer attention to water issues, really by estimating the costs of action to address externalities. And then second, the impact on valuation at the company and portfolio level. So we've narrowed in on 2 focus sectors for this first round of materiality briefs, and they are meat production and apparel. So we're undertaking the analysis as we speak. If you go to the next slide, we have a terrific set of partners who are joining us on this work to really ensure that it's robust and data-driven and led by the science. So the analysis is being led by our colleagues at Blue Risk, and we're in close partnership with S&P Global, who are providing equity data. And then our colleagues at DWS providing a valuation methodology and data and helping us estimate implications for asset owners and managers. We're also working in lockstep with our scientific partners. We want to make sure this is really based on strong science, the externalities that we're addressing. So we're leveraging the concurrent scientific work of the Global Institute for Water Security. So if you go to the next slide, we've identified 3 publicly traded packaged meat companies, just giving you an example of our first materiality brief. And to estimate the cost of action, we first identified, the breadth of water externalities. And as Kate, alluded to, we need to go beyond just scarcity and really hone in on water quality impacts and just the broader group of externalities as well. So we've identified these through the research that the Global Institute for Water Security is developing. And then we map these externalities in the scientific literature against the specific activities and sections of the packaged meat industry value chain. So you can see these all outlined in the table. It's quite comprehensive. Then we've identified a solution set and costs within the current scientific literature. And then finally, we're collaborating with DWS to really estimate that impact on the total cost of action may have on the company valuation using DWS's proprietary methodology. So if you go to the next slide, you'll get just again a sneak preview, and stay tuned. This will be released towards the end of the year. But this shows just the relative breakdown of cost of action across these three companies to address the externalities. We've narrowed in on externalities within different areas of the value chain. But again, this is only a teaser. We're finalizing the analysis and still conducting some QA/QC. And we look forward to releasing these in December. But we really hope that these briefs will help paint a very clear picture that, again, compels investors to engage with us around water risk.
Well, let me bring Francesco in here, because actually, how do you see investors actually leveraging these materiality briefs, particularly as it relates to sort of investment intentions?
Well, I mean, these are fundamental, right? Because the entire issue in the last sort of few years has all been on one side, companies saying, oh, it's going to be too expensive. And other people say, no, you must do it anyway. Well, let's face it, there is no better way than bringing science together with the financial community, together with some NGOs, to really understand what the story is. Data speaks, right? And I always said, one of the main issues I have with the entire, approach, to ESG is that you have the financial community, coming and say, this is material, this is not material. And I say, well, I am a financial analyst. I can come out with what I think is good for the environment or the world, but really, this should be led by science. So it is essential that we start to look at this materiality brief using science. Yeah, we must incorporate more science into the work that we are doing and provide good data for financial decision making. Yeah. Because ultimately, this is the only way that capital can be properly allocated and become sustainable, right? We used to be in a world in the past that, more than 100 years ago, there was no auditing function that was an independent function, right? It was the provider of capital and then the company, and the accounts were not certified, right? So they had clearly a conflict of interest, and that an auditing function came around, and this auditing function was, defining the level of profitability. Now that auditing functions needs to change. It cannot just be on financial return. It must need sort of to incorporate other ESG factors, because we need that independence. Otherwise, you're going to always have conflicts of interest in the capital allocation. But I'm diverting here, but the materiality briefs here, right, are fundamental, because ultimately, is the cost of addressing water risk too much or too little? That is the essential question we need sort of to answer. If it is too much, then the fundamental product is mispriced in the market. Think about tobacco and how cheap it was to buy, cigarettes 40 years ago. That product was mispriced. And now we need to do the same things with regard to water risk. If the cost is too little and the impact of valuation is too little, then there should be no fundamental reason, given the damage that this is creating to the world, to start to invest in addressing these issues. Because the thing that we need to do on water risk, we need to move from a linear approach. Yeah, we take water, yeah, we use it, and then it goes somewhere else. Now, guess what? 80% of that water that is, wastewater is untreated. That creates a massive environmental damage at many levels, right? So we must move from a linear approach to recognize that, we move towards a circular approach. And to go back to some of the points that were made, initially, this will create economic opportunities, not to bring water from 300 kilometers to California as an example, but think about circular cities. Yeah, is going to be an opportunity. It's not only a risk, because let's face it, some of these infrastructure was never built to last this long. It was never built to deliver water to so many people. Yeah, and just gray infrastructure, it creates an enormous amount of damage. So you need to move away from just gray infrastructure to, in type of infrastructure that combines gray investments with blue investments with green investments, and we must move towards a linear approach. So, in concluding, really, I see two components. First, I would say materiality that include scientific evidence is key. Second, I would say that we need sort of to move away from a linear approach to a circular approach and not to be scared to embrace it, because there is clearly, anyway, a risk with regard to existing assets, but a lot of opportunities will also emerge.
Controller, I wondered if I could bring you in the conversation, actually, whether that resonated with you, and also could you share how CalPERS and CalSTRs are also thinking about water?
Thank you, Michael. Very much resonates with me, Francesco, and that is, speaking of the linear approach, we really don't have the luxury to first start working on carbon and climate issues and then think about water. It is, I don't think, no company can operate on this earth without water. And so as I think about what we need to do as investors, we have to play a stronger stakeholder and leadership role, both investors and companies, on water issues. And we need to simply move beyond just recognizing that this is an issue that poses risk, and it is. And when I speak about a crisis, the opportunity here is to really look at how we elevate our action and really elevate it to scale. We, in the past, I think, have really focused on the larger companies who are showing more leadership on water issues, but increasingly institutional investors have a significant role to play. And that is, we're being seen as critically important stakeholders. We are exposed to entire sectors of the economy globally, and also to industries, and we can push for change at scale. And I think this is the critical piece in terms of how water risks and issues can be managed and addressed. At both CalPERS and CalSTRs, we've been looking at really addressing water risk as very integral to our ESG work. And we've made some notable progress in terms of shareholder proposals on water risk management, also with direct engagements with companies around their water stewardship efforts. And so I think everything that all of my fellow panelists have talked about really speaks to now is the time to elevate our engagement, our stewardship, our leadership, and recognizing that the fiscal and the physical imperative of a robust water supply and sound water policy is something that, yes, poses risk, but also creates tremendous opportunity as well, as Francesco stated. So, and I will say this is a time where I think the whole idea of water scarcity and certainly the adequacy of water has really been heightened. I know the convergence of just what we are dealing with the pandemic has really heightened the need for just the availability of water. We're asking people to wash their hands frequently, and there are still many communities in California that aren't able to even have safe water coming out of their faucets. And so it's really the consciousness around this, I think, has also grown. And so I just see this convergence of interests, both at the community, citizen level, all the way to the company level, to institutional investors. And I think we've got some momentum here. And certainly with the tools that are being developed, I am very hopeful that we can bring all of these actions to scale.
That's great. And, in a way, this webinar is really also trying to mobilize people to engage in this topic. So I'm wondering, Kirsten, if I could come to you just to say, let's look a bit into the future. Where is the Valuing Water Finance Initiative actually going? And how can people listening, colleagues, actually engage in this?
Great question. We need that on the ground action. So that's the key question of the day. So, we're setting this foundational stage, but our ultimate ambition with the Valuing Water Finance Initiative is moving towards achieving SDG 6 and ensuring a global sustainable freshwater supply. So of course, this is no small task, but as you've heard today, it's really extremely critical. And so our theory of change with this work is really similar to that of Climate Action 100. It really begins with the investor. And so in engagements with portfolio companies, investors can insist on them meeting specific performance expectations that really will result in that meaningful improvement in those high-risk watersheds. So that is our theory of change. And we really believe that these engagement efforts will lead to companies addressing these activities that are responsible for the most severe and systemic impacts on freshwater supply. And so as a result, the pressure on watersheds would be reduced. That is our theory of change. It's been, proven in other ESG issues, and we need to hit the ground running a lot faster on water risk. So to engage and sort of that call to action for everyone is really to be on the lookout for this case that we're building to really compel the investment community to join us in this effort. And we really encourage investors to join our working groups and ultimately to join our global investor engagement, which will be launched earlier next year.
That's great. Well, Kate, I'd love to bring you in actually on the conversation. I think you've said to me in the past that, the water disclosure work that you're doing at the moment could be potentially the most important thing you've really been doing at CDP, or at least one of them. I'm just wondering, could you just sort of share a little bit of what's happening in this area? How are we increasing the transparency of the actions investors are taking to reduce water risks and impact? Could you just tell us a little bit about that, and maybe how it links actually with Kirsten's work?
Absolutely. Thanks, Michael. So for the last decade, CDP's work on water disclosure is really focused on asking equities to provide information on behalf of and to institutional investors. So for investors have been acting as almost the scrutineers for the longest time, asking for corporations to provide water-related data about the steps and actions that they're taking to mitigate the risks and seize the opportunities that exist. And that's been a very powerful lever for change. We are seeing action happening amongst companies, but it's safe to say, I think, and I'm sure everybody on the call would agree, that the action that we're seeing is not at this pace and scale that it needs to be to solve the crisis that we're facing. And so we decided as an institution about a year and a half ago that we need to start pulling the institutional investor lever a little bit more strongly than we have in the past. And so we have decided to move ahead and develop a water-related disclosure framework for financial institutions themselves. So in the same way that you are now asked to provide climate-related data aligned with the TCFD, we will be developing a water-related questionnaire, also aligned with the TCFD, that will be issued to over 700 financial institutions next year. We're working with the Valuing Water Initiative, the same funder and lovely donor that's funding Kirsten's work. And of course, we're working in lockstep with Kirsten and the team at Ceres to ensure that the work that they're doing and the work that we're doing are truly complementary and help to ultimately align and accelerate the uptake of each one. So why I've expressed my excitement to you in the past about this particular piece of work is because of its potential to trigger truly systemic change. When we get the world's largest financial institutions on the planet actively thinking about and having to report out publicly the steps that they're taking to understand their water risks across their portfolios and loan books, but also to then report on the actions they're taking to mitigate those, it will trigger a systemic and cascade effect into the real economy, and therefore provide a much stronger incentive for companies to behave in a much more sustainable manner and ultimately deliver really positive outcomes. So how this fits with Kirsten's work, Kirsten is going to be publishing some amazing insights that, in theory, despite the best will in the world with the most amazing communications campaign, may well sit on the shelf after a year and a half when something else comes along. We can't afford for that to happen because the value of that work is incredibly strong. And so my work, in a sense, will be this, and the disclosure mechanism that we'll create will provide a regular, consistent incentive into the finance community to keep using those tools, to ensure that they're continuing to go to Kirsten's meetings and ultimately to go to the meeting, to leave those meetings and to act. And that's ultimately why we're all here today. It's an exciting proposition. It's a challenging one. We have to recognize where the broader financial market is on these issues. They're not all as advanced as DWS or as CalSTRs and CalPERS, unfortunately. I'd say the vast majority of investment activities, as we know, do not align with sustainability outcomes at the moment. So this is still quite a bleeding edge issue for many institutions to get their head around. And so we'll be issuing, we're developing the indicators at the minute, working with a whole range of market participants, yourself included, of course. We will be issuing the questionnaire to financial institutions. I think I mentioned around 700 of them in April of next year. We are thinking at the moment, working on on the quantitative indicators that we may well include. I think that's the complicated side of the agenda. How do we, what is the carbon footprint equivalent, if you like, of a portfolio? It's not easy or obvious to state what that is for water, because water is infinitely a little bit more complex than, unfortunately, carbon emissions are, as many of you all on the call will know. And so we are unlikely to move ahead with that type of request for 2022, but we do see that emerging from 2023, 2024 onwards, where we start to think about and ask institutional investors to articulate what their overall impact is on freshwater resources, so we can all move forward with confidence that the world is ultimately likely to succeed in achieving SDG 6 and indeed the goals of the Paris Agreement.
Well, I have to ask this question because you are the water lead for COP26 Climate Summit. It's just a matter of weeks away. What is needed from the finance community to address water risk, and what do you think we can expect to see?
Well, it is. I think we've got 15 days left, really not long at all, and my nails are bitten down to the quick, I think it's safe to say. What do we need from the investment community? Kirsten touched on it before, although she didn't quite use the term that I would use, which is an ambition loop. So the theory of change that sits at the heart of a lot of our work with financial institutions is that bold, ambitious leadership calls for more ambitious leadership coming from the finance community into the realm of governments is really an effective mechanism for driving better, more ambitious policy outcomes. And ultimately, that's what we need to see. Our voluntary mechanism that we hold at CDP, the voluntary interventions that Kirsten is offering at Ceres, will ultimately only ever take us so far. We will really need strong, clear legislation in order to bring the rest of the market along with us. And so, but at the moment, there is virtually no financial institutions standing up publicly shouting about how loudly they and how importantly they view this situation and how urgently they want and demand, if you like, government action on this topic. Kirsten mentioned the investor action for what is it called, Kirsten, again? Sorry, the investor action 100. Climate Action 100, sorry, that's the one, or the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. We can name, 10, 15, well, maybe I can't name them because I'm not fully caffeinated, even though it's late in the afternoon today. But there are a number of international investor campaigns focused on climate. You can't almost turn the corner without seeing one or bumping into somebody who's a member of one. That's amazing. Can anybody name any on water? No, there is not one. And I'll give you £10, Michael, if you can show me the latest news article within the Financial Times or in the New York Times that again makes it clear that the finance community cares about this topic and ultimately needs strong action. And so I would really advocate at this stage for more of that type of advocacy to be taking place at international and national opportunities. And what we can expect from COP, I think, is I'm working to bring a few of these voices into the event itself, and there'll be a major water moment on the 5th of November, where we will see some very, very high profile individuals talking about these subjects and ensuring that the negotiators in the space are aware of our needs. But I think we also need to see more post-COP. And that's where the activity, I think, will be focused, thinking about the outcomes that we will see from COP26 and how we might galvanize more ambitious outcomes for COP27. So it's an exciting, nerve-wracking time, but one that I look forward to with great joy, and look forward to seeing all of you there or hearing more from you on the road to COP.
Absolutely great. Well, I think you're right. We're people are waking up to this risk and they need to understand it. And I think the good news is, in terms of this webinar, if this is a clue, we've had almost 1,000 registrations listening to us. That's double the normal average of these webinars that are currently being hosted ahead of the PRI. So that may be a good sign. At least it's one little nugget. But Francesco, could I just sort of come back to you? What do you want to see, in terms of regulatory action, disclosure, investors? There's a lot of players here. To me, they're not as strong and as forceful as they should be. But what are your thoughts?
I mean, clearly, and Kate, highlighted this. The main challenge that we're facing is that a lot of these initiatives are voluntary in nature, and as you say, Kate, there is a lot of things that are focusing on climate. But if I even look at, what is it we're trying to do with regard to our path net zero at the DWS, let's not forget the path net zero, and we're part of the net zero asset manager initiatives. That is a voluntary target, right? A voluntary target, but because the assets are not ours, and asset management is driven by regulation, right? So every time that I have a voluntary target, that then I have sort of to implement into a portfolio that is driven by the regulation, I get massive, backlashes and sit, days and weeks with legal and compliance and about what we need to do with regard to the fact, is this detrimental to the regulatory framework? And ultimately, I think that this is what we need really to face, and this is what we need to demand from our politicians. If effectively this is a crisis, we cannot have a voluntary framework dealing with the crisis. Yeah, all of these requirements needs to be embedded into regulation in order to say we recognize that climate or water risk are a crisis. Okay, fine, that's good. Now, can we deal with this being voluntary, which ultimately, is beyond our sphere of influence, because we are delivering something to our clients? No, we can't do that. And this is why we think that, we really need to, if effectively, we are serious on addressing all these issues, we really need a transformational change that moves away from this linear approach that, assumes that, the environment or the world can take all these nasty stuff that we have been doing over the last 50 years. The Dasgupta review in the UK was very clear, okay? This is not sustainable. Now it is time, to help investors really and take some of the pressure away from them so that they can actually implement this. Because at the moment, what is happening is that investors need to understand the risks, they need to measure the risk, and they need to implement it. That is a massive conflict of interest. Yeah, as I said earlier on, in the 1920s, post the financial crisis, the auditing functions become compulsory in the States because there was a response to a crisis of conflicts of interest. Yeah, there. Now we need sort of to do something like this. If effectively this is a crisis, we need to look again at the roles and the responsibilities so we don't put undue pressure on the financial and investors, so they can actually implement these these frameworks that are addressing systemic risk to our system. So this is not to run away from our responsibilities. We'll keep on piling up, but the theory of change at a certain point, we risk having a backlash if all of a sudden we don't go to a point where 20, 30, 40% of the people are there, but then we started to have regulations come into place to help them. And that is, in my mind, one of the biggest contributions that our politicians could make in the next COP, which is basically to start to say, we are starting to help investors delivering on this by creating some, regulatory framework that will help them moving the assets from where they are to be more compliant with water risk, climate risk, biodiversity, and so on.
Thank you very much. And I did promise at the beginning that we would get to questions Q&A, because there's quite a lot coming in. So unless anybody on the panel wants to sort of respond to that, can I just go to some of these questions, because there's some really interesting ones coming in here. Controller Yi, obviously this isn't just a California problem. It's New Mexico, it's Colorado, it's Nebraska. I mean, there's quite a lot of states out there with similar problems. Is there a coordinated approach, best practice? Can we see kind of what Kate was mentioning, coalitions arising from various different activities?
Absolutely. So I will say that the work that Ceres has been doing, I think, is really all embedded in best practices. I mean, when you think about how we're actually going to continue to increase institutional investor awareness, how we're going to have the integration of water into our investment decision-making processes. This is all really founded on best practices. So I think that research is critical. I also will say that I think the way we're thinking about water is different. And by that, I mean that, yes, I agree with Francesco. This has got to be about government and policymakers taking a more critical role. But we're also seeing a groundswell of just the call for more urgent action from civil society all across the globe, including here in the United States, because the crisis is real in so many parts of our country. And so the advocacy, the actions by civil society has also elevated. So I think as we think about developing these tools and the activism that is actually applying the pressure for elevated action to scale, I think we're going to see some momentum being built.
That's terrific. Well, actually, there's another really valuable question here. And actually, we're all trying to understand how do we measure success, particularly when it comes to engagement. So Kirsten, could I ask you this one? Are there any success stories of active investor water engagement to date that you can kind of share with us?
Yeah, definitely. I think there are some bright spots. I mean, the bottom line in today's discussion is we need to do more, and we need more investors to join us, but there definitely are some bright spots. So I know, earlier in the conversation, Controller Yi shared the work that CalPERS and CalSTRs are doing with dialogues with companies and shareholder work around water risk. We are also seeing that at Ceres. One more coordinated engagement initiative that I can highlight is some work that Ceres and our partner FAIR out of the UK have been working on for the last 2 years. And this is a global meat sourcing engagement. And we are working with investors, a group of investors totaling 90 institutional investors with over 11 trillion in assets under management. And this group has come together and coalesced to really work with the fast food sector and really get at their protein supply chains and their meat supply chains, which really are such a huge user and polluter of water. And so this engagement is really diving into those water and climate impacts of the meat sector and working with the companies to really encourage best practices and ensure that we see those positive water and climate outcomes. So recently, Ceres and FAIR released a progress report that you can access on our website. And, we have seen some progress over the last 2 years. In particular, 5 of the 6 fast food companies have now set or are committed to setting SBTs, inclusive of scope 3 emissions, which really gets at some of those important land use issues, which have, if dealt with, have, those positive water outcomes. But we did note that there needs to be a lot more work on the water side. So, we are seeing some traction. That is one good case study. We also are seeing some good shareholder work in recent years around water quality issues. And so we're really taking lessons from these efforts. And of course, our climate efforts, such as Climate Action 100, as we build out the Valuing Water Finance Initiative and that investor engagement side. But we do have some building blocks. We just need to, really increase the ambition all the more so.
That's great. And Controller Yi, I think the questions seem to be quite focused on you guys in California. So You're doing very well so early in the morning. So thank you so much for being so alert. This one is actually, I think, Controller, what are some of the community level impacts around water that you're noticing?
Oh, my goodness. They are plentiful. But obviously, as I mentioned at the outset, there are really upwards of about 1 million Californians who don't have access to safe drinking water. And I think what we've seen from that is just this elevated activism and really just people who are affected in our most vulnerable of communities really starting to insist that they be part of the solution for attaining hopefully safe, lasting water, and also looking at how to have tools to build their own resiliency as it relates to water accessibility and affordability going forward. But some of the other things that I'm seeing, particularly in the agricultural community, as I said, our farms many of our farmlands are fallowing, but we have groundwater challenges, but also looking at the events of floods differently, the ability to look at floods as a new water source. And so many in our agricultural community are doing some very innovative things as it relates to trying to just capture this new source as water for the future. So I think what we're seeing is really an all hands on deck at the community level. This is a very real crisis. People are trying to cope with it, but it is also, I think, a good development that it's putting added pressure on policymakers here in California. And so I do think this is going to drive the ongoing attention to water, which is only going to help continue to drive the behavior of companies and certainly institutional investors to also follow suit. I have this longstanding dream that institutional investors and companies should be locking arms, marching in the halls of our Congress and our state capitals to really insist on some of the regulatory changes that we want to see to support the work that all of us are trying to do here. And so I am very, very hopeful that the community activism, I think, is a piece that I don't want to have be lost, because for the first time in a long time in public opinion polling, drought and water scarcity is really taking a prominent role in terms of top of mind concerns for Californians.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I wanted to actually, this question I think possibly is for Kirsten and Francesco and Kate, and I'm going to ask Kirsten to be a little bit quick on this one, give the other guy, Kate and Francesco, a chance. But I think it's to do with disclosure and frameworks. How does the work from the Valuing Water Finance Task Force, for instance, interact with TNFD? Is there a clear path towards convergence into a unique framework science base? So just your color, and then maybe a bit of a broader perspective from Kate and Francesco on that topic of coordinating, because there are a lot of frameworks out there.
Yeah, really quickly, I think it is critical. We need all hands on deck to, accomplish what we're after here with addressing water risk. And so we need to ensure that we're aligned and, in lockstep, and all of this work is complementary. So I know for the Valuing Water Finance Initiative, we're very much bringing in a lot of the expertise of our NGO partners, and really, leveraging the great work that's being done there. Ceres participates in working groups with, the SBTN for freshwater and some of the work Kate outlined. And on the flip side, a lot of these groups are participating with us to ensure that we're really aligned and all, at the end of the day, singing from the same hymn sheet. So it's really critical to have alignment among partners. And, we really need all hands on deck with the scale of the problem. So we really need to be aligned.
Kate, did you have anything to add?
Happy to come in, Michael. So the TNFD is emerging. It will be another 2 years or so before the framework is produced. But CDP is acting as a member of the standards hub that will be ultimately informing the outcome of the TNFD. Our frameworks, particularly on water and deforestation, are indeed incredibly relevant, given that they've existed for so long, and we've now normalized disclosure against a number of indicators that ultimately we hope will feed into and therefore be adopted by the TNFD as the indicators taken forward in the framework itself. I think it's got huge potential ultimately to mainstream nature-related financial disclosure, and CDP is fully supportive of this endeavour, and we'll be working in lockstep with that and other standard setters alongside GRI, SASB, CDSB to ultimately inform and then influence the outcomes so that we can move rapidly to action. Disclosure is the means to an end. I think that's worth noting here.
And Francesco, last word.
Well, I think that, you know, this is, I mean, we'll clearly learn a lot from climate because each of his effort, you know, is incredibly time consuming and is not easy to implement. So we cannot really have too many standards that are competing for becoming the best. You know, there is one water crisis, and I guess that, you know, we really must work together here in addressing all the obstacles that, you know, we are facing, whether it is regulations, whether it is disclosure, and trying to come out with a single standard that tries to bring together the different perspectives. And I'm quite positive about this because I clearly see that this is happening and, you know, looking forward, making water, you know, a more relevant issues for the investment community.
Well, I just want to thank everybody. We've got 1 minute left, and it was just a pleasure listening to you all speaking on this topic. Controller Yees, thank you so much for your time, as well as Kirsten in California, up incredibly early, I think probably 5 o'clock in the morning. It's a bit later now, but thank you so much. Also to Kate, your perspective, which was, you know, so interesting, so many hats. That, you know, I look at Kate and Controller Yee, you have so many hats. One job is not enough for you two. You've got so many multiple areas of focus. And so thank you so much for all of those different perspectives. Obviously to Francesca, who I work with, but also to you, the audience. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you've got a sense of the passion with which this topic engages all of our speakers, and really our call to action that this topic needs to be at the center of climate policy. And so this is the aim of this. It's really a call to action for all stakeholders. Water involves all stakeholders, all the way from governments, all the way down the investment chain. So thank you very much for joining us. If there are any questions, I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions, but please contact me and we will do our best to engage you on this topic. But with that, thank you very much. Thank you for the PRI as well. And I hope you have a very good rest of the day. Thank you.